Good evening, everyone. This is William Hiley from St. Matthew's Catholic Church. Thank you for joining us for our Wednesday webinar series. This week, our topic, we're going to focus on the question around Holy Week and tying back to the previous couple weeks of webinars where we're discussing the question that Jesus poses to his disciples, who do you say that I am? We're going to focus on this, especially in light of the Gospels of Holy Week. I invite you, if you haven't opened up our Pear Deck session, that's where you can participate by giving your online typed responses rather than just filling this space with all kinds of unruly and disorganized discussion. So I invite you to open that up if you haven't. If you're not looking to respond that way, then it's okay to just hang out and watch as well. But the next slide that I'm going to show you is going to be that familiar drag your dot slide to check in. So when I change the slide, I invite you to drag your dot, check in, let me know how you're feeling, green face, yellow face, orange face, or red face. Looks like, all in all, doing pretty darn good. I'm happy. Over 3 weeks doing this, I haven't seen a orange or red face response. So I'm glad to hear that everybody's hanging in there. Just a reminder that we here at St. Matthew's, our offices are still open, so you can still give us a call anytime if you're needing prayer, needing advice, needing some connection to some resources. We're still here for you. And we look forward greatly to the day when we get to celebrate liturgy together and gather again in person. So tonight for our topic, like I said, building on last week's, we're going to focus on who is Christ and what is his identity. We're going to do that by particularly focusing on the gospel readings of Holy Week, the major days of Holy Week, that is, Palm Sunday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then we'll save Easter Sunday for a little bit later on. Oops, scrolling. Specifically, we're going to give Holy Week a little bit of context, both in terms of the people and places, so that we can hopefully just maybe dig some more meaning out of this than in the past. Hopefully you can examine Holy Week through fresh eyes. We're going to do this with a mind towards interpreting Jesus's identity and mission, and then also towards gleaning some new personal significance out of Holy Week. So hopefully you find some of this information helpful, useful. So we'll do another one of those quick mapping activities like we did at the start of last class, because that seems, I got a lot of positive feedback on that. It seemed very helpful to a lot of people. So we'll do another one of those. Then we'll start going into and unpacking the gospel readings for the week. That's where things will be a little bit more lecture-y for a while. Before we get into a series of questions towards the end of the lecture, in which we will kind of start unpacking and sharing with one another via Pear Deck, just what that personal significance of the evening is. So now you should have a map on your screen. Take a moment before you start moving anything around and look at this map. This is a map of Jerusalem in the Old Testament. There are three locations in particular that I invite you to look for on this map. Once you find them, once you've found the Jerusalem temple, please drag your purple flag there. The blue flag you can put on the site of the Last Supper. That one's a really small one, so if you can find that one, good on you. And then once you can find Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion within Jerusalem, go ahead and place the red map, or the red flag, on that one on the map. I'm going to take just one more minute on the clock. Don't worry, this is not a geography quiz. I'm not going to fault you if you don't stick them exactly where. Just use this opportunity to explore the map. All right, looks like people have pegged down the temple pretty darn well. That's good, I'm glad. Likewise, people are finding Golgotha. Yeah, absolutely. So as people are finishing up moving your flags around, I just want to add in a little bit here. We're not going to go through any big synthesis questions on this, but just notice how, like, with those within that green line, which is the largest extent of the town wall that Jerusalem ever had, just notice how far apart all these things are within the city. Moreover, Golgotha, the red flag where you place that, that's actually outside of the oldest city walls within Jerusalem. So when Jesus would have been there, when he was crucified, he was actually crucified a little bit outside of town. Another thing to note is that this map, while not explicitly topographic, does show just how much of hill and valley is going on in Jerusalem. Interestingly, as well, there, you notice the temple is on a mountain, but then also the hill of Golgotha, where Jesus would have been crucified, is a east-facing hill. So Jesus would have been staring from the cross, quite possibly back east towards the temple, across Jerusalem in between. What Jesus saw from the cross, quite an interesting, different take on things, maybe. So we're going to leave that one there and move on, because when we look at Holy Week, we also get to we can come back to this idea of imagining how Jesus, or what Jesus would have seen from the cross, but why he went there in the first place, and who he wants us to know him to be. Jesus climbing the cross, Jesus going all around Jerusalem like that, is part of his self-revelation to us, telling us about his mission in his life and his purposes. So just to kind of get our brainstorm juices flowing right now, what is, in your estimation, in your mind, to you, this is just a personal opinion question, what is the most interesting character trait of Jesus? This could be, like, I don't know, something he seemed to like, something he seemed to not like, how he treated people, how he found himself, what he did with the people he met. These are just anything that you think of. What stands out to you about the personality or the characteristics of Jesus? Oh no, that's my computer thinking. So at the end of this question, I'll show some of the responses just to jog memories and get people thinking, sharing ideas. See lots of good responses here. I know we had a couple people fall out of the session there. Hopefully they were able to join back in on the Pear Deck side as well. Going to go one more minute on the response times. So if you haven't answered this question yet in Pear Deck, I invite you to do so. All right. All righty. So screen's locked. Here are some of the things that people are saying. People are contributing. Righteous fury. just being with people. I like it. I see willingness to help people, selflessness is a definite theme. Answering prayers, self-sacrifice. Jesus is love. Straightforward, to the point. I like it. Cool. So again, kind of building on the same point from last week, Jesus's identity is fundamentally who Jesus is. All these character traits of Jesus are fundamentally connected to his purpose. And in particular, the beauty of the Passion is that we see revealed in the Passion so much, so clearly who Jesus is. We see his selfless love. We see just how intent he is on connecting with people, even in the midst of this great persecution that he faces. So we're going to start and just walk through Holy Week gradually together, starting, of course, with Palm Sunday. If you weren't able to get a palm this past weekend, they sure went quick. So, hard to know right now with the numbers, but I hope you were able to get one. What does Jesus reveal about his identity through the events of Palm Sunday? That's going to be kind of our focus question. So I invite you to ponder and consider that as we unpack Palm Sunday together a little bit. A little important background, maybe again touching back on what we covered last week. During Jesus's time, the Jews and the people throughout Jerusalem were living in a state of expectation awaiting a Messiah. More particularly, they believed that this Messiah was going to be a descendant of King David who would come and save Israel and all the people from the oppressors and the powers that kept putting them down. In this case, a lot of Jesus's disciples probably thought that the power at that time was Rome. Naturally, Rome dominated a lot of aspects of life, but before it was Rome, it was the Greeks. The Greeks had conquered the area around Judea and conquered Jerusalem and sacked the temple. Before that, it was the Babylonians who came in and sacked the temple and put the Jews in slavery. So generally, it was a rough time to be alive. But the Jews kept waiting for somebody, a Messiah, who would deliver them from this. Now, this is kind of where that theme of the idea of the Son of David comes from the specific prophecy that the Messiah would come from King David's line. And so when Jesus is referred to as the Son of David, this is the people of Judea thinking back to the promise made to David that this Messiah would be his in his descendancy. Moreover, the miracles that Jesus performed, healing the blind people, healing the sick, raising the dead, all of these were interpreted as signs of somebody who was great and mighty and powerful, somebody who would properly be the king of the Jews, who had power to protect them from their oppressors. And this becomes even more interesting than when you see after Jesus enters in on Palm Sunday, being hailed as king by many common folk, so to speak, air quotes, common folk. When he enters the temple, we're all familiar with the scene where Jesus flips tables and throws things around and smashes the money changers' counters and drives them out with very strong words too. But draw attention to this verse that comes after that in Matthew's gospel, where it says, the blind and the lame approached him in the temple area and he cured them. Jesus didn't just stop at driving out the bad things. He saw those things as an affront to the true worship of God, no doubt. But then in their place, he institutes something different. He institutes a practice of healing, and he, in this sense, is doing a very kingly action. He is cleaning out the temple of all the evil things, of all the greed and the lusts that those people have brought to it, and is now instead turning the temple of God into a place of healing and a place of welcome for all people, not just those who could afford to buy their way in with temple sacrifices. So, kind of close out Palm Sunday, quick check-in. In your own words, would you say, what does Jesus reveal of his identity and mission through Palm Sunday? This doesn't have to be a long response by any measure. So take a moment to think about it, and I'll set a 1-minute timer here in a second. All right. So again, kind of just going back into show responses here. The fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. But yeah, I don't imagine flipping money tables made him popular with people. Reveals his authenticity by being very real and angry at the temple. Mission is to serve God. His reaction shows how serious he is. Commitment, no doubt, going right up against the system of the day. I am the Messiah, the Son of God. Very good. Moving on. So the Holy Thursday begins the last phase of Holy Week. We're going to skip over the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and get to the Triduum, as it's called. It's a 3-day feast that all flows all together. Most of us have been experiencing this all throughout our lives, but perhaps different days have meant something different to you at different times in your life, or you've been able to relate to one more than another. So we'll start with Holy Thursday, and we'll cover Holy Thursday and Good Friday today. And again, consider then, we're going to pick up on this theme of kingship and how is Jesus acting as a king. I invite you to consider, what kind of king does Jesus reveal himself to be through the events of Holy Thursday? Because we know that people expect him to be the Messiah, the one who's going to save them from all their oppressors. But how is he going to go about doing that? So on Holy Thursday, we start with a really beautiful image in John's Gospel. This is the Gospel that we'll read from this Thursday, of just how majestic Jesus really is. The author of John, says that, Jesus is fully aware that God has given him power over life and death, over his own destiny. He knows that he is truly in control of the situation, and that he is not has nothing truly to be ashamed of. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, here at the climax of Jesus's ministry is where Jesus institutes the Eucharist and gives us that great sign, that great sacrament that we enjoy and are empowered by all the way through the centuries, even to today. But John's Gospel doesn't even mention the Eucharist, actually, at the Last Supper. There is no connection to it at all. And so what John offers us instead is this dramatic image told in very short, choppy sentences, that Jesus instead prepares himself and then goes to serve his disciples, getting down on his knees, taking off his outer garment, which is a symbol, of vulnerability, and then getting down to do what the lowest of the low servants would do for other people. Now, he's not even just serving lowest of low to the king, he's serving dirty disciples, dirty commoners, effectively, if you want to go quote commoners again, where these are people who generally would regard themselves as too unclean to be honored in this way, and yet Jesus comes down, gets on his hands and knees, and honors them in a concrete act of service and humility. This ruffles some feathers. You see, of course, Simon Peter's is the most prominent in John's Gospel, whereas, Master, are you going to wash my feet? Are you going to wash my feet? How can you do this? You're supposed to be this messianic king who is above us, so far above us, and how can a king stoop so low? It's almost a horror to see the king brought so low, and to do so willingly. Why? This is not behavior that befits a conquering king. And yet the disciples in the end allow it. And Jesus says to them, what I do now, you don't understand, but you will understand in time. And it ties back to an earlier part of Matthew's Gospel, a particular section that I really like. Just so the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And then the allusion even forward in time, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Service and sacrifice, two important parts of Jesus's life. So now this next slide got a little bit messed up, so I'm going to have to show you the question, and then we'll jump on to the one after that where you can actually respond. What kind of king does Jesus reveal himself to be through the events of Holy Thursday? Here is our actual response slide. I apologize for the mess up. So just to repeat the question for anyone who may not have caught that fully, our question is, what kind of a king does Jesus reveal himself to be through the events of Holy Thursday? Now my mic is back on. I'm getting better at juggling this thing slowly. So some of the things that people are sharing on this matter. Gives himself through service and sacrifice. Good king serves and sacrifices for his people. And there's all kinds of Old Testament parallels to that. Like the king in the Jerusalem temple in the Old Testament had a certain role in leading, or at least authorizing, the sacrifice in the temple. So even then, even when it's not sacrificing himself, the king is still tied up with the priests in the role of sacrifice, more concerned with people than himself. Gives this humility, brotherhood, love, gives himself for others, for the least. Humble and wanting to serve. Now, yes, I think those are all certainly qualities that it would be great if we could have all of those in our leaders today, in our leaders, kings. I don't think it's very political to say these are desirable things that we'd want to see in our leaders, especially in a democracy. So excellent stuff. Jesus is good leader. Jesus is good king. Advancing to next slide. So we're at about like the 2/3 of the way mark through the night. How's it going? Trucking along? Anything too weird, too complicated? Feel free to drag your dot and leave it just so I'm feeling where people are at. Seems like this is, yeah, going pretty straightforward and good. Glad to know it. As always, of course, I welcome your feedback, so you're welcome to send that along. Now we're going to jump into a slightly longer section, but to me, where things get really interesting. Because one of the days of Holy Week that has always stood out to me from my earliest memory of childhood all the way forward has been Good Friday. Because there are just so many differences in Good Friday versus regular Mass. For example, we don't actually celebrate Mass on Good Friday. We only ever have a liturgy because the Eucharist is never consecrated. The priest does not pray the words of consecration and therefore transform bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ on Good Friday. Instead, on Good Friday, we bring the blessed hosts out, the consecrated body and blood that was blessed the night before, and use that and distribute that. But no Mass anywhere in the world is celebrated on Good Friday. Moreover, the cast and the characters you see on Good Friday are just so strikingly different to me. And I want to especially focus in today on Pontius Pilate, because he is a really interesting dude. For one, he is probably the most prominent non-Jew that we meet in any of the Gospels, if only because of his role, but also because of just the questions that he asks Jesus and the discussion that he has with Jesus. So I invite you, as we consider some of these questions and statements of Pontius Pilate through the Passion, to consider, what does Pilate reveal about Jesus's mission and his identity through this? A little background on who Pilate would have been. At the time, Judea, where Jesus pretty much spent his entire life and his entire ministry, was a small regional province within a larger, more or less, state within the Roman Empire. It was in the province, the province of Syria, and then there was this little group area called Judea. Now, therefore, Pilate was the appointed Roman governor of Judea, appointed by the emperor to this task. He was the most powerful person in the province of Judea, with authority to oversee trials, to call upon the guard to enforce the law, and to determine whether the law was being fairly enforced. Interestingly, as a part of this, Pilate got to appoint the puppet king of the Jews, King Herod, who was nominally a royal, but mostly there to, he was a puppet king. He didn't have a lot of power, truthfully, without Pilate behind him. And Pilate also got to appoint the chief priest, who oversaw the temple and Jewish worship that year. So imagine how strange and offensive that would have been to have somebody other than a Jew, for the Jews, designating who leads their people and their worship, even their religion. Now, when the dialogues actually begin between Pilate and Jesus, therefore, Pilate has a unique perspective that's very focused on that could be read, at least, as being focused around civil authority and questions of making and preserving the peace. When Pilate sees Jesus, Pilate sees somebody who allegedly claims to be a new king of the Jews, right? So he's got his puppet king, but now this is an upstart. Is this another revolutionary? Is this somebody who's going to lead a rebellion? Or is this some lunatic? Pilate is determined to get to the bottom of this. And so he's very straightforward and asks this to him, but Jesus turns it around, very much like the Samaritan woman back in the start of John's gospel. Jesus turns the question around and makes this about who Pilate thinks Jesus is, rather than actually about who Jesus himself is. Jesus has been called by many titles: Son of David, Son of Man, Messiah, the Christ. Pilate would have heard all these, but Jesus is less interested in saying who he is or who he thinks he is than he is in learning about who Pilate thinks he is. And in this way, Jesus is going to force him to wrestle with that question more. So Pilate runs through this whole gauntlet of questions with Jesus, before, in the end, effectively deciding to make a political example of Jesus. Remember, his job is to keep the peace. He has every legal authority to do so. And he sees in Jesus a possible revolutionary start. And so in mocking Jesus, in shaming Jesus, and having him tied up, whipped, and beaten, he's trying to show the Jews, perhaps you could say, that Rome still rules. There is no king but Caesar. Whatever you're trying to do here, knock it off. But he's met with this ridiculously strong opposition that doesn't seem to make any sense. Pilate, I don't know exactly what Pilate sees in Jesus. Maybe he sees him as a madman. Maybe he sees him as as somebody with lofty aspirations. But one way or another, Pilate's asserting his authority, and he sees that these people are not satisfied with that. So what's he going to do? Well, honestly, it's hard to imagine what's going through his head. But finally, at last, admitting, in a certain sense, saying, look at this one who is the king of the Jews. We have power over the king of the Jews. Decides, very good, we'll give them their wish, and we'll crucify this king of the Jews. But I think it's very interesting here, especially in John's gospel. Again, this is what we'll read on Good Friday, that Pilate is actually challenged when he has an inscription written for Jesus. Pilate has written, Jesus, the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, again, probably for political purposes, to make an example of Jesus, and he has that posted to the cross. The Jews, their leaders, actually push back and say, now, have it say instead, I am the king. He said, I am the King of the Jews, to make sure that it's Jesus's words that are condemning him. But Pilate here instead presents the idea, no, this is the King of the Jews. Interesting, and he stands by it, saying, what I have written, and he does not change that. Interestingly enough, we can read this as a kind of prophecy fulfilled, because even though this guy absolutely didn't appreciate Jesus, see him as the Son of God, and probably meant a strange political point by it, he nonetheless witnessed to a certain truth, that this man is, through his service, through his sacrifice, through all these things, the King of the Jews. So now we come to the end of Holy Week. We've had the disciples wrestling with who Jesus is. We've had the crowds crying out, Messiah, Son of David. We have had even Pilate, a Gentile who has no allegiance to the Jewish religion, questioning who is this guy, the Son of Man, the Son of David, the Anointed One, King of the Jews. He labels him in the end. But the question remains unanswered in John's Gospel because Jesus still has not definitively said who he is. So who is this Jesus of Nazareth, and what is he actually about? Ultimately, it's a question we all have to decide for ourselves and respond to. So we're just going to keep this particular part a little short. In one sentence, if you had to summarize who Jesus is and what his mission is to you, what would you say? Again, I'll share this slide in a minute with folks, so if you haven't responded in the Pear Deck slide, I invite you to do so. One sentence summaries are a great way to kind of draw things together. So, alrighty, jumping over to that particular slide. This guy, whoever this was at the start, decided to use a semicolon. Crazy grammar people using semicolons. The one to come and fix the separation. Oh man, a hyphen and a semicolon? Gosh, I love it. Grammar for the win. Thanks, y'all. So this is where we get into the kind of the more question heavy part of the night, especially because we get to the more application question. In particular, out of the days we've talked about today, we've talked a little bit about Palm Sunday, a little bit about Holy Thursday, and a little bit about Good Friday. Which of those days resonates most with you? Whether that inspires you, scares you, challenges you, which day stands out to you right now? Multiple choice question. Got 4 responses, 5 responses, 6 responses. Can we get up to 11 responses? We're close. Getting closer. Nine out of 18 responses. Maybe we can get to across the 10 threshold. All right. So it looks like overall on this one, it's a pretty even spread. I'm impressed and happy to see people taking interest in Holy Thursday. That's the day that, at least growing up for me, I didn't hear a lot about it and I didn't know a lot about it. It actually took me going to college before I actually went to a Holy Thursday Mass. So now I want you to consider, why does that day stand out to you? And how will you keep that significance in mind this week? Especially, what will you do, maybe, to embody that day this week? We'll just add a 3-minute timer on the clock. Actually, we'll go, because I want to get out of here by 6:45 with y'all, because I want to respect your time. We'll make it a quicker timer. Oh, whoops. Here we go. Now I'm back. That's on me. I thought that I had the sound on. Anyways, conclusions. We're on the drawing slide. Conclusions. What have you learned today about our Messiah, about Jesus, about his mission and his identity? Man, somebody drew a crown of thorns. That's really cool. I'm gonna have to show that one. Click. I am very impressed by the things that people can draw with a mouse, because goodness knows, I cannot. Let's see. I like it. Okay, I'm going to share just a couple of these real quick. And then I'll get onto announcements and send everybody on your way. I think this is Jesus flipping tables. I really like Jesus flipping tables. One of my favorite things. Ah, so good, so good. Next slide. So, just some announcements to round out the night. Please note there will be no webinar next Wednesday. Have a blessed Easter. Enjoy the octave of Easter. I pray that with your families things go well. As always, if you need prayer, do not hesitate to reach out to me via email. I'm also happy to look into resources or anything that I can find to help you and your family grow in faith during this time. I am willing to explore. I'd also love to hear which topics you want to learn about in our future webinars after Easter. So please click on that blue link there. It should be live to fill out the survey for future webinars. And lastly, we're looking at talking about what we can do with these webinars at a wider scale. So if you would be interested in joining a small group to discuss these webinar topics after Easter, please mark yes, I'm interested on this slide. If you leave it blank, I'll assume you're not. These could be possibly diocese-wide in scale, depending on how this goes. So we already have people from Casper and from Laramie and from Sheridan all in this particular workshop tonight, but we could possibly grow that in the future. And lastly, final slide, thank you for your time. If you haven't had a chance to mark anything, you're always welcome to email me with any questions. Please enter your name so that I know you were here, and that way I can identify who actually wants to be in a small group with other people in the state. So please go ahead and mark that in. And once you've done so, I wish you all the best of evenings. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this fruitful. And as always, I'm praying for you. Please pray for me, and have a blessed, happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Day. Woot, woot.